Hey everybody, Tim Parrish here for the Huntington Church of Christ, and I want to welcome you to Wednesday in the Word. Over the last several weeks and months, we have tried to kind of pick through the pages of the biblical narrative and find those characters that maybe are a little bit more obscure. Maybe there's not entire books or chapters devoted to their stories, and yet somehow they show up in the biblical narrative and they make some kind of impact. I've tried to find ways to, without over-moralizing those stories, bring some of those into the present time so that we can learn some lessons that are appropriate for our time from these ancient characters. I have some more of those lined up in the weeks ahead. In fact, a couple of you have shared a couple of different suggestions with me, and you're more than welcome to continue sharing those characters maybe that you'd like us to discuss out of the biblical story. I want to take tonight and spend a little time with an entire family, 4 generations, in fact, of a family that shows up in the biblical narrative, particularly in the New Testament, primarily in the Gospels and the book of Acts. And as we see this 4-generation family, we see that not only can positive traits and values and morals and ethics and principles be passed from one generation to the next, but so can immorality, and so can despotism, and so can things that are negative and dark. Generation after generation, we tend to pass on those kind of things too. And sometimes once that ball starts rolling down the hill of time, it's really hard, not impossible, but really hard to stop that. And so you just end up with a train wreck. And that's kind of what happens in this particular family. Now, to really understand how we get here to this family, the Herodian family, we're going to back up and look just a little bit at some things that kind of help us put this into focus. Now, I came upon this because I'm preaching this Sunday out of Acts chapter 12, and there is a mention there to King Herod, and I wanted to make sure which Herod it was I was talking about, and it just caused me to realize what a twisted up, mangled up mess this family is. But it wasn't that way in the beginning. The first character that is introduced to us in this family is Herod the Great. Great is a name that was given by himself, not so much one that I think we ought to apply today, although as a builder he did some amazing things, things that are still standing today. We can still see the impact of Herod the Great, who ruled from about 37 BC to about 4 BC. But before that, during this period of time that we know as the intertestamental period, that 400 years or so between the end of the Old Testament prophecies and the beginning of the Gospels, time-wise, there's a pretty good gap of time there. And we know historically, we find ourselves on the front end of that, still thinking about the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemies and how all these empires are vying for power before ultimately the Greeks and then the Romans come into power. Well, coming out of that, there are some really terrible things that happen in Jerusalem at the hands of one of those leaders in particular, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. How would you like a king or a ruler that named himself the appearing of God? Well, that's Antiochus IV was one of those, and he actually took a sow into the temple and butchered that sow and spilled that blood all over everything that was sacred and holy. And as you can imagine, that was about as devastating a thing as could be done in the eyes of the Jewish people. Well, as they continued to be oppressed during this particular period of time, there rose up some people from among the Jews known as the Maccabees or the Maccabees. Perhaps you're familiar with the composition by Handel from the 1700s, Judas Maccabeus. Well, that's written about one of the leaders of this group that would eventually revolt and throw off the Seleucid rule. And even to the modern era, Jews are still looking back, thinking of that group of people, of the Maccabean people, as heroic leaders. In fact, I was reading an article in preparation for this that came out of the Jerusalem Post, and a very modern article that talks about the heroic Maccabean people and the longing that still exists for that kind of heroic leadership to this day. Well, that kind of sets in motion some things that will become a part of this story. Not so much Herod the Great himself. Herod the Great is by birth an Edomite. Now you may remember that Edom is another name for Esau. And so when you think in terms of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Jacob's brother Esau, there's a divide there. And the descendants of Esau are the Edomite people. Well, cousins to the Jewish people perhaps, but not the same. But eventually, we're going to see a connection where a daughter, a princess from among the Maccabean people, the Hasmoneans, marries Herod the Great. Now, most marriages in those days, especially among the ruling class, were not marriages that had anything to do with love or affection. They were marriages of political alignment and those kind of things. Well, that's what happens with Herod the Great. But Herod the Great comes on the scene in about 37 as the ruler, the king of the Jews, so titled. He had been appointed earlier as the governor of Galilee by Mark Antony. And so you see all this really interesting interplay with notable historical figures from the Greeks and the Romans, and then how he figures into to the political scene there. The Roman Senate is actually the group of people that appointed Herod the Great as king of the Jews. And that was a very interesting title, because you may remember that's the title that was then applied to Jesus upon his death, hung over his head by Pilate, the King of the Jews. And of course that stirred up some things. We're not going to talk about that. But in Matthew, the opening chapters of Matthew, the birth story of Jesus, we're introduced to Herod the Great. Herod the Great is the one who received the wise men from the east when the birth of Jesus happened. And he was very troubled. In fact, we will see about him that he was a very jealous man, a violently jealous man. And so when you think in terms of the butchering of the babies that comes at the hand of King Herod, that's actually not very surprising. It seems to fit quite well with the kind of person that he was. We know that King Herod, who appears there, Herod the Great in this case, who wanted to kill Jesus, who tried to kill Jesus, the actions of this Herod are the actions that sent Jesus and Mary and Joseph into Egypt, where they would stay until he died. It just fits with a man who was married to at least 10 different women. We know the names of about 8 of those. There's a couple of them we're not sure of their names. But he thinks nothing of murdering his wives and even his sons if he thinks that they are a threat to his power and to his empire. In fact, one of the connections that we'll eventually make here with the Herod in Acts chapter 12 is going to come from, it's a miracle that he even survived. We'll talk about that when we get there. So we see this first of the New Testament Herods as Herod the Great. Among the women he married were Miriam, Hasmonean princess, the one from the Maccabees. Then he marries Malthace, and we'll talk about why she's significant. He marries another woman from Jerusalem named Miriam, and then he marries Cleopatra, but not the famous one from Egypt. This one is a Cleopatra who is from Jerusalem. Now, from these marriages, there are multiple children. Among them are Aristobulus, Herod Antipas, Herod Archelaus, Herod Philip, and Philip the Tetrarch. Not to be confused, those two half-brothers, but not the same character. Now, Aristobulus doesn't figure much into the historical picture because he's one of the ones that was murdered. Yes, a father murdered his son because he perceived him as a threat and was afraid that he was going to try to take over the throne. This is not the first time or the only time that he would act in this way toward one of his descendants. Also from the wife Malthace, that's who gives us Herod Antipas and Herod Archelaus. Herod Archelaus is the Herod who shows up in Matthew chapter 2 when word gets to Egypt that King Herod the Great is dead, and it's a good time to return for Jesus and Mary and Joseph. They don't return immediately because there is some fear on the part of Joseph that Archelaus, the son of Herod the Great would be just as bad. Well, it doesn't take long until Archelaus is removed from the throne. And then what begins to happen with some of these other sons and when they rule and where they rule and how they rule is really more in depth than I want us to get to today. But I do want you to think about some of these connections with me. So you have Mariam II, the one from Jerusalem, who gives birth to Herod Philip. Now, Herod Philip becomes an interesting character because he marries Herodias, who is, well, she's his niece. She is a granddaughter of Herod the Great. She is the daughter of Aristobulus, who was murdered. She doesn't fare well from all of this. That Herodias marries Uncle Philip. And the two of them together have a daughter named Salome. Now she ends up divorcing Uncle Philip and marrying Uncle Antipas. Literally his half-brother, still her uncle. And so now they're married. But it's this really weird thing that causes John the Baptizer to criticize this marriage. You may remember that. He calls out this illicit marriage, and that really angers Herodias. And Herodias and Salome hatch this plan by which they convince Uncle Antipas and Uncle Philip to execute John the Baptizer, literally to bring his head in on a platter. Well, that's really weird how all that interplays, right? So we see that happens in Matthew chapter 14, if you're looking for that in your New Testaments. Well, if you back up just a little bit to that same generation of grandchildren. So we have Herod the Great, we have these wives and their children, and then from those we have the next layer of grandchildren. Now there's more there than we're going to talk about, but for our study, for my focus in on Acts chapter 12 this week, that's where we go. So we go to Herod the Great's marriage with Mariam I, who is Maccabean, and then Aristobulus, and then his children, Agrippa I and Herodias. So Agrippa I is the King Agrippa that shows up in Acts chapter 12, the King Herod who is there in Acts chapter 12. Now you may remember that from that chapter he arrested and put to death by the sword James, that's John's brother, the son of Zebedee, and he arrested Peter with every intention of making this big public spectacle of his execution, except God had other plans and that did not happen. But King Herod Agrippa also marries, and he gives birth to a number of children, including Bernice or Bernanke, King Herod Agrippa II, and Drusilla. Now Drusilla ends up marrying Antonius Felix. And Antonius Felix is a character that shows up later in the book of Acts with the Apostle Paul. And Paul has some interaction with him in Acts chapter 24. He's the one who leaves Paul in prison. Now, why in the world did we take any time to look at these characters, to see this progression? Well, mainly because it is a fascinating story of how generation after generation after generation can continue to impact the story of God's people. Because that's what happens here. Literally, every generation of this family for 4 generations impacts directly the story of Jesus and the gospel and the church and the disciples. And so it's fascinating to me to watch how these put together. Now, I'm going to put up a graphic here in just a moment, and I want you to take a look at this graphic because it is, I think, one of the best ways to visualize this. And if you're a visual learner, then maybe this is helpful to you. If not, that's okay too. It's not mine. I didn't make this up. And there are some gaps here that it doesn't answer for. But we'll take just a moment, let you take a look at that. If you'd like a copy of this, I'd be happy to email it to you as well, or give you the link where you can go find it and look at it. So let's take a look at this graphic for just a moment. Then we'll come back and talk about any lessons that we might take away from this. So one of the ones that we didn't mention earlier, we mentioned his name, Herod Agrippa II, is also one who interacts with the Apostle Paul. It is before Herod Agrippa II in Acts chapter 25 and 26 that Paul is examined and gives that great speech that you may remember there. And so many members of this family are directly connected to the gospel story. Now, I think one of the main lessons, and really this is kind of where I used all of Acts chapter 12 to push toward in Sunday's sermon, is the idea that when God sets something in motion, just as it may be difficult to stop bad things from passing generationally through our family, it is impossible to derail what God is doing, even though the same family keeps showing up and trying to kill Jesus or trying to kill the followers of Jesus. Jesus ultimately dies on the cross, and there are connections still to this family with the bouncing back and forth from one authority to another during that time, connection there too. But none of that stopped the movement of the scheme, the story of redemption. None of that stopped what God was doing with Jesus and through Jesus. None of that stopped what God was going to do through the followers of Jesus as they carried on. If anything, this just serves as a catalyst. It just accelerates the story of the gospel. Now, I'm fascinated by that because sometimes God is too small in our estimation. Sometimes we think that certain things would impact what God is doing or would limit the ability of God to interact in some way or to accomplish His purposes. Sometimes we may even kind of feel that way today, like the events of the world or the political situation or just the difficult people in our life would somehow limit what God is able to do or would prevent God from accomplishing His purposes. And I think from thinking about the Herodian dynasty, and I look at all these and how they all fit together, one of the things that just becomes abundantly clear is there's just no way for even the strongest of families to stop what God is doing. Now, maybe there's a lot more we can learn historically, and certainly we've only just scratched the surface of this thought tonight. But maybe that's the thing that we're supposed to see and take away from all of this. Nothing can stop God. With God, nothing is impossible. Even when wicked people parade themselves as religiously true, nothing can stop what God is going to do. Thanks for stopping by.